mentioned that ICFA were looking for somebody to do some research on outcomes for the Global Refugee Forum for the Asia Pacific, and I somewhat naively put up my hand, not knowing how many hours of trawling through the online dashboard and different Excel spreadsheets that would mean. But I hope that the research that I present today to you will be helpful in some way, and really happy for you to interrupt me or take questions during the presentation. Just might move on to the next slide and give a quick overview of today's agenda. So we'll just look at the tools or the tables that were pulled together from the research, a bit of a chat around the methodology that was followed, a review of the findings, and then going into some question and answers, and then we'll be handing over to Katja from UNHCR to talk us through some work that they're doing and next steps in the region. Just on to the next slides. So as Kaya mentioned, the aim of the research was really to look at all of the pledges that were made at the Global Refugee Forum and kind of identify and analyse the gaps, but also the patterns in pledging and how they affect the Asia Pacific region, and then mapping from there, I suppose, ways to take work forward and where we can focus our advocacy as organisations and within the region, and where we can kind of pressure governments that have made commitments to move forward from the Global Refugee Forum. So on to the next slide, just a quick overview of what's captured in the research. So the research covers pledges made from the 1st of January last year up to the 15th of February this year. It looks at the two main multi-stakeholder pledges that were made for the region, so the Afghanistan and the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledges, and then beyond this, pledges that also are related to support for displaced Afghans or host states, and similarly other pledges that maybe weren't part of the multi-stakeholder pledge but also outline support for Rohingya in the region or host states as well. The pledges in the mapping also include supports to other host states in the region, so those that aren't included in those two main multi-stakeholder pledges. It includes pledges that were made that outline sustainable solutions, so for example, resettlement for forcibly displaced populations in the region, and it looks at what pledges states in the region made, and then looks at domestic policy pledges, particularly by third party countries, so for example Australia and New Zealand, the commitments that they made as part of domestic policy changes moving forward from the GRF, and then finally gives a short overview of the global resettlement multi-stakeholder pledges and how they may be helpful for us to think about in the context of the Asia Pacific as well. Happy to move on to the next slide. So this slide just gives an indication of an example of one of the tables, and I thought it would just be helpful to break down what each of the categories are. So on the far left-hand side, we have the receiving entity. So this is either the host state. So for example, Afghanistan is included here as a country of origin, but the host state would also be Bangladesh. So it's not always clear-cut, but in general, it's fairly self-explanatory. I think that the entities in this region typically are countries that are hosting displaced populations, as well as also Myanmar and Afghanistan, which are also countries of origin. The next box along is the submitting entity. So that is obviously non-government organisations or states or the private sector who pledged support for a particular state or displaced population. And then the colour of the row indicates what type of submitting entity it is. So green for non-government organisations, blue for UN agencies, grey for state or state entities such as the European Union, pink for private sector, and orange for other, so academic institutions or other pledging entities where it was unclear what other category to place them in. There's a pledge description, and then thematic areas of assistance are broken down by, this is fairly self-explanatory, but at the end of the report there is an appendix which is a list of around 30 different thematic areas of assistance, and if you're searching for something in particular in the tables, you can click on that little arrow and type in a filter, for example health, and then it will filter by all the pledges that are related to health. Similarly, for types of assistance, this includes material assistance, scholarships, cash, and then focus groups includes those groups that are most commonly identified in pledges where a group has been identified. And I think I've drawn around 8 different focus groups. So this includes women and girls, children, people of diverse OGS, people with learning difficulties. But if there is a particular group that you're interested in that's not captured in this focus group column, you can also Control F of the whole tables or search in the pledge description for that keyword, and it should still filter for you. And then target number, persons of concern, if the pledge has indicated a number of people that it's seeking to reach, it's also included in that column there. So we can see that the pledge by passage aims to reach 100 Afghan women to assist with scholarship and studying higher education via Canadian universities. And then the final column is just indicating whether or not that pledge was part of the multi-stakeholder pledge that it would align to. So in this instance, the Afghanistan multi-stakeholder pledge. So this information is captured in the tables, and then it correlates to the report where there's kind of a summary drawn around particular groups or pledges for particular areas, thematic areas of assistance, for example. Moving on to the next slide.
Alani, I might just come in on the part of the multi-stakeholder pledge. Something to note is basically people put their pledges and then they had to link it to the multi-stakeholder pledge. So you'll see in a number of cases, as Lana goes through, that there are some pledges that were not put to the multi-stakeholder pledge, but that's maybe an issue of just linking or a technical issue versus it not contributing to the multi-stakeholder pledge. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. I think on the next, this slide also speaks to that as well. So for the Afghanistan and the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledges, there were pledge documents that outlined pledge ideas that pledging entities could consider when putting forward pledges. And we can see I've highlighted here where gaps are, where pledging ideas were outlined in the document but not met in the pledges. But also in this table in the Excel spreadsheet, there's a little asterisk beside the submitting entity where they made a pledge that reached a pledge idea in the pledging document, but they weren't actually part of the multi-stakeholder pledge, so they weren't linked, as Kaya was mentioning. So we've tried to capture broader than the multi-stakeholder pledge, but obviously it can be a bit complicated when that isn't always clear in the pledges that have been made. So what these tables do, the summary of the Afghanistan and the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledges, is just show, I suppose, where the gaps are and opportunities for further advocacy, and those are highlighted in yellow. We can go through at the end of this presentation as well, the Excel spreadsheets, if it's helpful. Moving on to what's not captured in the research. So any pledges from the previous, so the first GRF up until the 1st of January, and any pledges after the 15th of February this year. There's other things, for example, the type of non-government organisations, so faith-based or civil society or INGO, these are all just categorised as non-government, so it doesn't break down by type of non-government organisation. There's a list of categories outlined in Appendix B, which refer to thematic areas of assistance, as I mentioned, and type of assistance, but anything outside of this isn't captured in those columns. And obviously, despite my very best efforts, this research is not a definitive catalogue of pledges made to support host states and displaced populations. It was often, the research was carried out by searching keywords. So for example, searching India or searching Bangladesh. So where organisations have made pledges that don't correlate to those keywords, it's very hard to capture them in this research. So just keeping that in mind, that this is generally an estimation and our best efforts in trying to draw together what we know to have been pledged, but there may be things that are still missing from this research. Moving on to the next slides. So we'll just run through the 2 key multi-stakeholder pledge outcomes. So starting first with Afghanistan, we can see that overall there were 23 pledges made to Afghanistan, 15 for Pakistan and 7 for Iran. There were almost 40 pledges submitted in total, so 13 of those were linked to the multi-stakeholder pledge, and then the additional have not yet been linked, but I've included them in the analysis. And around half of these were submitted to by non-government organisations as well, and around the other half submitted by states. So the multi-stakeholder pledge for Afghanistan, many of you would be much more familiar with it than me, but generally the priorities were in line with the SSAR, and the aim was to produce pledges that are aligned with either leading to voluntary returns, sustainable reintegration, or support for host countries. So in the next slide, I've just pulled out the pledge as an example, the pledging document, and basically it sets out 3 core areas that pledge asks for at the Afghanistan multi-stakeholder pledge, and under these there's particular asks around infrastructure for access to basic education, for example, or scholarships for tertiary education. So I won't go into the detail of this, but just to give you an idea of how the mapping was carried out. So I looked at these multi-stakeholder pledge documents, and then moving on to the next slide, this was mapped against the pledges that were actually made. And so we can see the subcategory aligns with the categories on the previous page. And as I mentioned before, the rose and yellow are where there's no pledges that have been made towards that particular pledge ask. Moving to the next slide gives an overview of the findings from the Afghanistan multi-stakeholder pledge. So overall, we can see that there were more pledges towards education, particularly higher education online programs for Afghan women. There was a smaller number of pledges towards healthcare, but these did include pledges towards sexual and reproductive health, general health programming, and also mental health services. There were a number of pledges towards livelihoods, but they were very general in the sense and didn't necessarily meet the particular pledge ideas set out in the multi-stakeholder pledge document. And there were a number of also general development humanitarian pledges. So, for example, by the Danish Refugee Council, Korea and Denmark, and they kind of signal longer term programming in Afghanistan. And they don't always specify which areas in development they will cover. So it's possible that they could also meet the pledge ideas in the multi-stakeholder pledge. Moving on to the next slide. So applying a similar methodology for the pledges that were listed for Pakistan. As I mentioned before, there were 15 pledges submitted supporting Pakistan or displaced Afghans in Pakistan and host communities. Half of these pledges were put forward by states. So you can see that in the slide there, and the other pledges put forward by either UN agencies and 2 non-government organisations. The pledges for Pakistan largely align to those set out in the multi-stakeholder pledge document and focus mostly on either education or healthcare. There are some gaps, particularly around where Pakistan document asked for support and registration, data collection and resettlement opportunities. Those particular areas in the multi-stakeholder pledge document didn't receive pledges that could support those outcomes. Moving on to the next slide. So similarly for Iran, a lot fewer pledges compared to Afghanistan and Pakistan. The majority of these were by states, except for a few by HAMI, a non-government organisation. HAMI's pledges focused on bringing displaced Afghans into the health and education systems in Iran and trying to target broadly, it's unclear how they would do this, but target broadly 15,000 students in the education system and 12,000 women to have access to healthcare. There was also a small number of pledges aimed towards livelihoods and improving employment outcomes. Moving to the next slide. So overall, the summary from the Afghanistan multi-stakeholder pledge follows that the trends across the pledges more broadly is that the majority of pledges tend to focus on building resilience as opposed to sustainable solutions. So there is relatively few pledges for resettlement or complementary pathways, despite that obviously being a key pledge ask. Australia is the only country to specify resettlement places for Afghans in their GRF pledges. Germany did pledge additional community sponsorship places, but they didn't attach a number to this. And similarly, the EU pledged to support member states with admissions for Afghan applications, they would remain a high priority. But again, there's no number attached to how many this would mean. There's support for access to basic services in Iran is an area that probably stood out to me as not receiving the pledges compared to the scale of the issue in Iran. Obviously, that's very context specific. And similarly, gaps in pledges for Pakistan were around data collection, registration, and documentation. One other key point to make would be that while there were a few pledges around long-term development assistance to Afghanistan, these were relatively few in number, obviously given the current situation, but also something to consider given the need and the unmet need currently in Afghanistan. Moving to the next slide. So applying a similar approach for the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledge. There were 40 pledges submitted as part of this multi-stakeholder pledge, so many more. And then an additional 20 weren't linked to the pledge, but were relevant in the sense that they focused on displaced support for displaced Rohingya or host communities. So almost half of these were submitted by non-government organisations and the other half submitted by states. And 5 of these were made by states in the regions, which is listed there on the slide. It's important, I guess, just to highlight that the majority of the pledges in the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledge were for Bangladesh. And a very small number, around 6, outline direct support for Myanmar, mostly humanitarian assistance, but also a couple of pledges around advocacy for improving conditions for return, particularly in Rakhine State, and to do with healthcare services. There was also a small number of other pledges towards host communities in the region that also host Rohingya refugees, and that was for Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Moving on to the next slide. So this is just an example of the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledge document. It doesn't specify pledge ideas in the same way that the Afghanistan multi-stakeholder pledge document does, and broadly just sets out 2 priority areas. So the first are sustainable solutions, and the second is resilience. So the way that I've mapped the pledges for the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledge is to use the breakdown within this bubble that's on the screen there. So resilience is broken down into health, education, etc., and solutions is broken down into resettlement, return conditions, and complementary pathways. So looking at the next slide, obviously, you won't be able to see these pledges in detail, but essentially this is all of the pledges that were made to the Rohingya multi-stakeholder pledge or related to displaced Rohingya. And the first at the top is a very small number of pledges outlining solutions, so resettlement, or in some cases, complementary pathways that could lead to permanent resettlement. And then the vast majority of pledges you can see below that relate to increasing resilience of Rohingya displaced in the region or host communities. And 95% of these are outlining support for Bangladesh or host communities in Bangladesh. So moving on to the next slide, just talking about, I suppose, the specifics of what was kind of came out of these pledges. We can see that I found that 3 states, so Australia, US, and Canada, submitted pledges committing to resettle Rohingya refugees, but similarly to the Afghanistan pledges, there's no number attached to this. So I suppose that's an interesting point for future advocacy or opportunities to follow up. There's a few pledges that outline advocating for safe, dignified and voluntary returns to Myanmar, but there's not really any pledges actually taking active support on this, and this obviously is reflected in the current situation, but just important to note that states did make a mention of this in their pledges. When it comes to resilience, there's a lot of pledges towards livelihoods, support for education and skills development. The livelihoods pledges tend to be focused on climate resilience and adaptation. I've included some examples there. So there's some pledges focused around agricultural work and bamboo farming. The education-focused pledges, some of them are advocacy-based, so calling for secondary students to be included in national education system, for example, but also more for delivery of education services and programming in the Cox's Bazar camps. Healthcare pledges are quite broad, but there's a few that are very specific in outlining neonatal, maternal and child healthcare for those in the Cox's Bazar camps. Climate-focused pledges include support for adaptation and mitigation, but also strengthening local capacity on disaster risk reduction. And then was a number of other pledges that didn't really fall into the categories outlined in the multi-stakeholder pledge document, but they tend to include thematic areas ranging from food security, WASH programming to shelter. Moving on to the next slide. Hopefully I'm doing okay for time, Kea. This is an overview, I suppose the second half of the presentation is an overview of who submitted what, which states submitted what in the Asia-Pacific region. So here's an outline of the countries in our region that made pledges at the Global Refugee Forum. And moving to the next slide is an overview of host countries that received pledges in the Asia-Pacific region. Noting that receiving a pledge is obviously slightly problematic terminology, but just in essence, the pledges that were made that are included in these counts outline some form of support and assistance, either directly for the country government or for support for displaced populations in that country. So we can see Bangladesh received the most, and followed by Afghanistan, and then a few other pledges to Laos or Philippines and Vietnam as well. A few of these countries were both states that gave and received pledges as well, which we'll get into in a couple of slides. So just looking at the pledges by country, so starting with Australia, Australia made around 23 pledges at the Global Refugee Forum and pledged around $265 million in funding for assistance for different crises globally. Australia outlined a number of resettlement commitments. So they're outlined there on the slide, but further points of interest for Australia include the potential complementary pathways, including refugee labour mobility, higher education pledges that, while they are very unclear as to how permanent these arrangements are, do offer a scope and a path forward for potential further work in Australia in terms of third country solutions. Australia committed to establishing a refugee advisory panel, which was a first, and also alongside New Zealand pledged to share expertise and technical advice with interested states on machine readable travel documentation. Moving on to the next slide. So Japan made 9 pledges at the Global Refugee Forum, made pledges around gender and the women's peace and security lens in its work, particularly in development and humanitarian assistance work that it carries out, and also made a number of pledges around promoting the humanitarian peace development nexus approach in its forced displacement work and settings, and also outlined a number of pledges to assistance for specific host communities and displaced populations globally. Within the Asia-Pacific region, I've included those on the slide. So support for Rohingya in Bangladesh, and also support for Afghanistan, Iran and Pakistan as well. a small number of places for resettlement, and also a commitment to scope opportunities for higher education for refugees in Japanese universities. This isn't clear whether the pledge is referring to refugees already in Japan, or whether this could be something that would be a higher education pathway similar to the one that Australia is currently scoping. Japan also made an interesting pledge around a law that was passed, and someone on the call might know more about this than me, where somebody seeking asylum in Japan who meets all of the Refugee Convention requirements other than the 5 grounds would also be granted complementary protection, so essentially the same protection as a refugee, and be entitled to Japan's settlement support program as well. Moving on to pledges committed by South Korea. So similar to Japan, a number of pledges around the humanitarian peace development nexus in its programming or assistance in refugee support in the region and beyond. South Korea provides official development assistance for refugees, and this is aimed at reducing the burden on host countries, but also supporting displaced communities and emergency assistance for refugees in climate and conflict settings in the region. And similarly also outlines a pledge to post-secondary education for refugees in Korea, and a pledge towards increasing its UNHCR contributions by 4 times. Moving on to Indonesia, the Indonesian government didn't make any pledges at the Global Refugee Forum, but did receive a number of pledges, mostly from the UN country team in Indonesia, and these outline support for trying to include refugees in Indonesia in national education and health programs. One of the pledges also submitted by an NGO outlines particular educational support for displaced persons in Indonesia, and that's not tied to Rohingya refugees, whereas the other pledges are. There weren't any pledges made to Indonesia either that were by state, so these all came from either UN agencies or non-government organisations. Moving on to the next slide, just a quick overview of pledges made to support Malaysia. So similar to Indonesia, the Malaysian government didn't make any pledges, but the pledges that are made in support of refugees and displaced persons in Malaysia outline support, or usually around education and providing online learning. Some of them specify report for Rohingya, but mostly they're broader pledges for refugees in Malaysia. And again, similar to Indonesia, none of these pledges were put forward by states. And then moving on to Thailand. Thailand made 8 pledges at the Global Refugee Forum. These include pledges towards assistance for Myanmar, but also working towards improving or moving away from using detention as a primary facility for people seeking asylum, improving access to education, and removing Thailand's reservation to Article 22 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And the support, the pledges that outline support for Thailand are from the UN country team, and this looks at assistance with registration and documentation and access to national systems. And the NGO pledges look more at providing education and online courses for refugees in Thailand. So I think I'll pause there. That was a lot of information and me talking at the screen, but I'll check if there's any questions, Kaya, or if you've got any comments you would like to make.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lani. You did that very well. That was a lot to get through, but it was very easy to understand, so thank you. Maybe one caveat we just have to flag